Hello, everyone, and welcome to Big Science Day as part of our Black in Genetics Week. Today, we'll hear from Dr. Jazlyn Mooney, who is coming to us from the University of Southern California's Department of Quantitative and Computational Biology. We're excited to hear from you, Jazlyn.
Thank you. All right, so I'm going to tell you about some work that I did during my postdoc at Stanford with Dr. Noah Rosenberg that we're going to continue working on in the future. And I'm excited to share it with everyone. So let me go ahead and get started. All right, so today I'm telling you about a recently published piece in Genetics, which is a flagship journal of GSA. It's titled On the Number of Genealogical Ancestors Tracing to the Source Groups of an Admixed Population. So I'll give you a bit of background about the time period, and then I'll actually walk you through a little bit of the math that we're using to describe the admixture model. Currently, the model only uses information from the autosome, but eventually we'll incorporate information from the sex chromosomes. That's something that we're working on actively. And then lastly, I'll tell you about how we actually estimated the number of genealogical ancestors from each source population that contributed to an admixed population. So we're actually going to be talking about African Americans when I'm talking about admixed populations here. So I want to give a bit of background about the timeline that we're working within. So thinking about the timeline of our model, it's focusing mostly in this period where we have the beginnings of what in America became chattel slavery. So remember, in 1619, America wasn't actually established, but what would become America was there. And around 1619, chattel slavery begins. So that's the beginning of our modeling time point. And then around 1808, we begin to see a slowing down of the importation of slaves because it has become illegal. So mind you that though it has become illegal, slaves are still coming into the Americas. And then in the end of our model is this time point around 1865, where slavery is actually abolished. And then we go forward into the present time, where we're actually looking at African Americans who were born between 1960 and 1970, so during this segregation and Jim Crow era. So a brief reminder of what was actually happening during the transatlantic slave trade. There were actually many more people that disembarked, where were forcibly sent from, there were many more people that embarked from Africa than actually disembarked in the Americas. So only 88% of slaves that were forcibly sent across in the Middle Passage across the world actually made it to their destinations. And that's something that's really important to note, is that many people actually died during the Middle Passage. And also I want to mention that though we're focusing on North America in particular, the US, that the vast majority of slaves were actually not sent to the US. Many of them were actually sent to the Caribbean. So that is something that is important to note. So what happened here was only a fraction of what was going on within the world. So like I mentioned before, we have our model. What it's doing is it's starting at the beginning of 1619 when chattel slavery formally begins, and then we're going to go forward in time through the era of active slavery, through the time that slavery is abolished, and then it finally ends with individuals who are born between 1960 and 1965, so during the segregation and Jim Crow era. So now I'm going to tell you a bit about this process. So we're actually not tracing your genetic ancestors in this study, we're tracing your genealogical ancestors. And there's a real importance here, because when you're thinking about tracing your roots as an African American person, a lot of the time, and this is actually highlighted in the book In Search of Our Roots, you hit a brick wall, right? And that brick wall is generally the 1870 census, which was the first census that was taken that included African American individuals. after slavery was formally abolished, right? But when we're thinking about this census, one, it wasn't all African American individuals, it was the African American individuals that were accessible to these people. And it also only pertains to African American ancestors that you have, right? It doesn't actually tell you about your African ancestors. So this census is really a brick wall that many African Americans, myself included, hit. And we really wanted to get past this brick wall. So this was the big thing for this project, is breaking past that 1870 census, breaking past that brick wall and gathering information that otherwise would not be accessible. But on that note, I do want to say that I just want to make the distinction one more time that your genealogical ancestors are not the same as your genetic ancestors. So that's what's shown on the plot here. So over here is the present time, and then we're going back into the past. So this is marked in generations in the past. And what you see is that the dashed line quickly separates from the solid line, and the y-axis is your expected number of ancestors. So what happens is your genetic ancestors are going to plateau off because there's not actually enough room in your genome for everyone to be your genetic ancestor, but your genealogical ancestors are just going to keep growing exponentially all the way into the past. Another way to think about this is if we think of you as this little hemisphere on this plot on the right, and then the blue and the red indicate your parents. You go one generation back, we have our 4 grandparents, we get to our great-great-grandparents. You'll notice here that I've put some arrows into white space. So those white spaces are actually genealogical ancestors that are not your genetic ancestors. And you'll notice as you go further into the plot that the number of genetic ancestors is quickly going down, and we're seeing more and more white space. So we're interested in your genealogical ancestors and trying to get numbers for your genealogical ancestors, not your genetic ancestors. And this interest of mine actually came from my own family tree, which I'm showing here. So my grandfather was really big into genealogy, and in New Mexico, he would actually go and he would trace our family back into time. And it turned out that this individual here, Luis Pineda, who's pretty far out, so we think he was born in about 1734. It turns out that he himself was African American. So not only on my mother's side do I have African American ancestors, I also have them on my father's side. So I was really interested in trying to figure out, can I figure out how many, not just African American ancestors that I have, how many African ancestors do I have, or how many European? So this is something that really motivated me to do this work. And here I'm showing a little bit more that we were able to learn about him from these records that my grandfather was able to track down. And actually in New Mexico, he was listed as being the color quebrado, which was used back then to describe individuals who are admixed between Native American, African, and Spanish. So I think that the reason we were able to get to this information is because my grandfather was so persistent about it. So on my maternal side, it turns out that we can trace ourselves all the way back to Spain. But as far as on my paternal side, we have nothing other than stories that have been passed down in our family. So this project was really important to me. So let's get on to the project. So what we're actually modeling is, you can think of an admixed African American individual as being this focal point in the tree. What we're doing is we're going back into time, and when you see this dark box, that means we've traced one of your ancestors to a source population, either 1 or 2. And once we hit one of these sources, we assume that all your ancestors going further back in time just belong to that ancestry, so they don't flip back. So you can see here on the other side of the tree that we haven't hit a source population, so we keep going back into time until we do, and then we stop counting. So we're actually counting the number of 1s and 2s that are in this deep red and blue color in this pedigree. So that's what we're actually estimating. And we're doing that by actually looking at ancestry proportions from a present day population. So we're taking the ancestry proportions of present day individuals, and we're using them to estimate the number of individuals from each source population that contributed to them in the past. And we do this by implementing a mechanistic model of admixture, which I'll walk you through. So what we have here are two source populations at the top. So in generation 0, they admix, and they establish our admix population that we call H here. And what these arrows indicate are admixture fractions, or the rate of admixture. And then we move forward through time. We allow admixture to continue to happen from each of the source populations and the admix populations established. And in the end, we have a model where we have the fraction of ancestry of the present day admix population, and we also have the rates of admixture from each of the source populations. And alongside of that, we have a summary statistic that we call Z in here. And Z is actually a random variable that's the number of ancestors from each source population that contributed to the genome of an admixed individual. So this is just from a random run of our model, but what you can see is that for source population 1, we have a distribution of the expected number of ancestors. So that's what we're using. We're modeling admixture rates through time and the fraction of ancestry from each source population, and we're able to estimate our random variable Z. So just with that information, we're able to compute the number of individuals from each source population, 1 and 2, that contribute to the genome of an admixed individual H. So those are the basics of our model, and we're going to implement that model to learn about African American genealogy. So the real gain that we have here is that we're able to break past the brick wall of this census and go back into time and actually ask, how many ancestors do you have from each source population? And here the sources are going to be how many African and how many European ancestors might a typical African American have in their genealogical history. And we can get this information by just using global ancestry. So to get started, I gave you some background before, right? What we actually did is we used this background information to implement our model, and we split our model into 3 periods. So the periods are active transatlantic slave trade, slavery, and then the segregation era. So we model information from these 3 periods, and we make some assumptions about our model. So the first thing that we did is we need to establish our admixed population, and we do that by assuming that all the initial ancestry in Epoch 0, or just before 1619, is coming from African individuals who are forcibly transported into the Americas. And we also make another assumption, which is that when you're looking at the rates of admixture, they must sum to 1. So during the first epoch of our model, which is during that time period where the transatlantic slave trade was legal, we're actually able to get demographic information that allowed us to estimate the fraction of non-European parents who are African arrivals to the United States, and that is implemented in this little parameter called CG. So we get this from a paper that was published in 2020, and we're able to implement that information to further refine our model and get these estimates for African ancestry and African American ancestry during this time period. And we fix the rate of European ancestry to range somewhere between 0 and 25%. And this is just reiterating that. So the information is actually coming from getting the number of slave births and enslaved migrants during the time period of active slavery and the active transportation of individuals from Africa into the Americas. During Epoch 2, we don't actually have that information because remember now slavery is illegal. So we just go for what we believe is a biologically realistic set of parameters. And in Epoch 3, we do the exact same thing. So Starting here, we've implemented our model. Now what we wanted to look at is how does African ancestry and European ancestry shift through time? So what you can see is at the beginning of our model, the vast majority of our ancestry is actually coming from African ancestors and individuals who are African American. And as we go through time, what you'll see is we start shifting away from primarily African ancestry, and we're seeing more African American ancestry. And as we're going further in time and we're getting closer to the time period where the importation of slaves becomes illegal, we see less and less African ancestry and this shift to more and more African American ancestry. So in the end, we end up seeing that the vast majority of ancestry is actually coming from the established African American population. And through this time period, remember, we fixed European ancestry, so we always see a small fraction of European ancestry as well. In Epoch 2, we end up seeing, once again, remember, the importation of slaves is no longer legal here. So the vast majority of your African American ancestry is coming from African Americans that are already in the Americas, and there's still some contribution, right, of European ancestry. So I think that's around 4%. The same is true when you get to Epoch 3, which is present time. So this is thinking about individuals who are born around 1960. We see the vast majority of their ancestry is African American, but there is still some European ancestry and a little bit of African ancestry. So the majority of your African and European ancestry, though, is actually occurring in the initial epoch, right, and not the present time. So we can track ancestry through time, but let's get an estimate of the number of ancestors, right, because that's originally what our goal was. And when we run our model, we actually end up finding that if we are to take an average African American who was born between 1960 and 1965, they tend, on average, to have approximately 314 African ancestors and 51 European ancestors. So that number, 314, is actually like something that's really important. One, because that information on this number is not available in census records, right? You're very, very unlikely to find an African ancestor. But also it's important because it's giving you an estimate of potentially how many of your ancestors survived the transatlantic slave trade, and survived the Middle Passage, right? So that's a pretty poignant number when you're thinking about this, right? And as far as the European ancestors, right, this time period historically was a really tough time, and we can't say anything really other than we know what was happening during that time. And the vast majority of your ancestry is coming from European ancestors during this time period of active slavery, right? So we know that there's at least 51 of those ancestors that were introduced into the average African American's genealogy, and that's a number that we can put there that previously was not there. So the last thing that we wanted to do is actually narrow down how many ancestors are coming in and at which time. And we're able to do this by looking at this equation. It's a non-recursive mean. You don't need to know too much about it, other than it allows us to get the expected number of ancestors that are coming in at different periods of time in our model. And what we basically find is that the number of African and European ancestors not only varies across generations, we can see that the height or the peak is roughly around the time period where we see the transatlantic slave trade being quite active. So it actually peaks just before the peak of the transatlantic slave trade. And then the number of ancestors goes down through time because we actually see the establishment of that African American population. And we can also, if you're interested in doing genealogy, right, something you might be interested in figuring out is when should I look for these African and European ancestors? So we find out that you have a very high probability of finding at least one of them during the peak of the transatlantic slave trade, but you can find any number of them through time. And actually, if you followed Michelle Obama's book about her family history, after doing a lot of sleuthing through her genealogy, they were actually only able to recover like one additional ancestor. And it turns out that our model predicts you would have a pretty high probability of finding an ancestor during that time period as well. And it turns out but that ancestor was in fact not African, they were European. So what we've been able to do with this model is actually go from demographic information, translating it into a mathematical model, and then getting an output, which is the number of European and the number of African ancestors that a typical African American might have, as if they were born between the period of 1960 and 1965. And I just want to note when I say this, the reason that I'm specifying the period when someone was born is because these numbers will change if you model an individual who's born at a different time, because we have different amounts of ancestry, right? So with that, I'm going to close out and just say this paper was really important to me, not only for thinking about my own family, but thinking about other people who are African American. And it allowed us to get a lot of insight, not only about genealogy, but actually how many ancestors from a typical African American were likely forcibly displaced during slavery and survived the Middle Passage to the Americas. And these are numbers that we did not have before. And it also gives us an idea of how many European admixture events occurred as well. So I believe that's it. I will stop sharing my screen.
That was incredible. Thank you so much for sharing that. Your work is so important and it's really big. I think it's a big deal. So yeah, I greatly appreciate your time and yeah, all of the work that you've done. Thank you so much. And
Yeah,
yeah, that's great. And we'll see you online for Big Week.
yeah, for sure. I will be there, and I will be watching on X, I guess.
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.